Hey, my name is Owen Marsh. I'm 30 years old, and I run the only large animal veterinary practice left in Larkspur, Montana, a ranching town small enough that the whole population could fit inside a single county fair grandstand with room to spare. I took the clinic over 2 years ago when my father died, along with his truck, his client list, and $41,000 of debt he never once mentioned to me while he was alive. Most days I'm up before 5, treating colic or calving trouble or a torn tendon on somebody's cutting horse, and I don't get home until the light's long gone. That's the whole shape of my life. It isn't a complaint, it's just the math, and most years the math works out fine. That August, the math wasn't working out fine. The bank had already called twice about the balloon payment on the clinic building, due the first week of September, and a corporate outfit out of Billings called Bridger Peak Animal Partners had been circling Larkspur for the better part of a year, buying up small practices one county at a time and hanging a chain sign over the door where a family name used to be. They'd made me 2 offers already. I'd turned both down, and both times the no had cost me something I couldn't afford to keep losing. The one number holding my books together was the contract I carried every August with the Larkspur County Fair. Just under $19,000 for keeping every horse, steer, and mule on those grounds sound enough to compete, and that contract came up for board renewal at a public hearing on the 3rd Friday after the fair opened. I needed it the way you need weather to cooperate. Quietly, constantly, without much say in the matter. I lived alone above the clinic, in the same 3 rooms I used to visit on weekends as a kid. And if you'd asked me that summer whether the quiet bothered me, I'd have told you no, because a man gets used to almost anything if he does it long enough. A woman named Paige had lived up there with me for the better part of a year before she decided that loving a large animal vet meant loving a phone that rang at 3 in the morning more than it meant loving me. And she wasn't wrong to leave on those terms. I didn't chase her. I didn't have much left in me most nights for chasing anything that wasn't already down in a stall somewhere, bleeding or breech. That was where I stood, that second Saturday in August, when the fair opened its gates, and I drove out before 6 to start my rounds. The fairgrounds sat on 200 acres just past the edge of town, and by 7 the livestock barns were already loud with people arguing gently with animals that outweighed them by half a ton. I was working down the row of holding pens behind the arena, checking teeth and hooves and the particular worried look a horse gets before a competition, when I found a woman on her knees in the straw of pen 14, arguing with a bay gelding who did not want his front leg touched. He's not lame. She didn't look up from the straw. He's dramatic. There's a difference. I crouched down next to her anyway, because dramatic and lame look identical for the first 10 seconds. And I'd learned a long time back not to take anybody's word for it, even when they turn out to be right. I ran my hand down the gelding's cannon bone, felt for heat, found none. She was right, Josie called her. She kept working a burr out of the horse's mane like it owed her money, not looking up. And before you ask, yes, I know he's dramatic, and no, I'm not scratching him from the 3 o'clock because of it. Wasn't going to suggest it, I told her. Good, because everybody suggests it. She had a braid that had mostly come loose by 7 in the morning, dust on her jeans to the knee, and a thin white scar across 2 knuckles that looked like it came from fence wire, not vanity. None of it seemed like information she was offering me. Just information that happened to be true whether I noticed it or not. I told her I was the fair's vet that year, and handed her a card in case anything changed before her run, and moved on down the row, and if I thought about her again before 3 o'clock, it was only because Larkspur is small enough that you remember most faces, and I hadn't seen that one before. By 3 the grandstand was packed, and the announcer had that half-enthusiasm, half-auctioneer voice they all get at county fairs, running down the names of the barrel racers while dust hung gold in the afternoon light. I was standing at the gate end of the arena with my kit, because that's where the fair paid me to be during events. Close enough to reach an animal in under a minute if something went wrong. Josie came out of the chute on the bay gelding at a dead run, and for about 14 seconds she was the best thing I'd seen at that fair all day. Low over his neck, first barrel clean, second barrel clean. On the turn into the third, his front leg caught something in the ground that shouldn't have been there. I heard it before I understood it. A wrong sound underneath the hoofbeats, a give in the dirt where there shouldn't have been give. The gelding's front end dropped. Josie went over his shoulder. The whole grandstand made a sound I can still hear if I let myself. He rolled once, trying to catch himself, and came down partly across her legs before scrambling up and bolting for the open end of the arena. And Josie didn't get up. I was over the rail before I'd decided to be. I don't remember deciding, just the running, and then I was on my knees in the dirt beside her, doing the same 3 things I do with an animal that goes down hard. Check the airway, check for the kind of bleeding that doesn't wait. Keep the neck still until you know it's safe to move. She was breathing. Her eyes opened, unfocused, found my face, and her hand came up and closed around my wrist so hard I felt her nails through my sleeve. Don't, barely a word at all, don't let go. I told her I wasn't going anywhere. I kept my other hand flat against her collarbone, telling her to hold still, that help was coming. And around us the crowd had turned into the particular chaos of 200 people, all trying to be useful at once, and mostly succeeding only in getting in each other's way. Somebody was already running for the first aid tent. Somebody else was shouting for her family, and getting no answer because her family wasn't there yet. Connie Buell from the fair office, who'd seen me crouched in that straw with Josie that morning, working on the gelding's leg, must have decided she knew more about the 2 of us than she did. Because when the medic came shoving through the crowd with a stretcher and shouted, "Is anybody here her people?" Connie pointed straight at me. "That's her fiancé, right there." I opened my mouth to say something. I don't know what. It didn't matter, because the medic, a broad, fast-moving woman named Gail Thorne, who I'd also met that morning restocking her kit, grabbed my free hand in both of hers, like I'd just handed her the best news of her week. "Thank God, you're her fiancé. Stay right there. Don't let go of that hand. You're riding with us." Josie's grip on my wrist only tightened. Her eyes stayed locked on my face, like I was the only steady thing left in a world that had just come apart on her. I thought about correcting it. I had the words ready. Small, simple. I'm not. We met 8 hours ago. They never came out. 30 seconds later, I was climbing into the back of an ambulance, holding the hand of a woman whose last name I'd learned that morning, and whose whole life I knew nothing about. The ride to Larkspur Regional took 11 minutes. I spent every one of them watching Gail cut away part of Josie's sleeve and talk in that flat, unbothered voice medics use to keep a person from panicking, while Josie kept her eyes on mine, like letting go of that thread would let go of something worse. Gail asked me 2 questions I had no business being able to answer. "Any allergies you know of?" "I don't know," I told her. Gail didn't even look up, just called it in as unknown to whoever was waiting on the other end. "Does she take any medication regularly?" "I don't know." Same lack of surprise. If it struck her as strange that a fiancé couldn't answer either question, she didn't have 2 seconds that morning to spare on it, because we had bigger problems. A fractured wrist, 2 cracked ribs, a concussion mild enough to keep her talking, but bad enough to keep her confused about which year it was. At the hospital, they took her back through doors marked "Family Only" in red letters, and a nurse at the desk looked at the paperwork Gail had handed off, looked at me. "You're the fiancé." It wasn't really a question, so I didn't really answer it. I just followed her back. An hour later, with Josie's wrist splinted and waiting on an orthopedic consult, a nurse came by with a clipboard. "Not for the procedure," she said. "Just the contact and visitation paperwork. since Josie was still too foggy from the concussion to reliably recite her own information. Who to notify? Who's allowed back here with her? That kind of thing. She tapped a line near the bottom of the form and held out a pen. Relationship to patient. Fiancé, is that right? I looked at that line longer than I should have. One word, printed small, above a signature that would sit in a filing cabinet somewhere long after that day was over. My father used to say the truth costs you once, and a lie costs you every day after. I thought about Josie's hand closing around my wrist in the dirt. I signed it. A different nurse came in with the real form not long after, the one that actually mattered, needing Josie's own signature for the wrist procedure now that she was tracking well enough to give it herself. Josie signed it one-handed, wincing, and never so much as glanced at the fiancé line stapled behind it. She grew noticeably clearer a little before her family arrived, blinking at the ceiling, then at the IV taped into her arm, then at me, still sitting there in my dusty work shirt with her blood-dried brown along one cuff. Why does that nurse keep calling you my fiancé? Her voice was flat and careful, the voice of somebody whose head hasn't decided yet how much it wants to hurt. I told her everything, quiet and fast, before anyone could walk back in. Connie's mistake, Gail's hand on mine, the form. I told her I was sorry, that I should have corrected it the second it happened, that I'd go find someone right now and straighten it out if that's what she wanted. Quiet stretched out between us long enough that I thought she might actually be furious with me. Then, is my dad on his way? Yes. Then don't. Not yet. Let's get through today first. We'll figure out the rest of it after. I didn't know, sitting there, whether she meant figure out how to correct it or something else entirely. I didn't ask. I just said okay, and meant it more than a man who'd known her since 7 that morning had any right to. Her father got there 40 minutes later, a broad, weathered man named Walt Calder, who moved like every step cost him something, ever since the stent they'd put in his heart the year before. Behind him came her sister, Wren, younger than Josie by a few years, and sharper in the eyes, the kind of sharp that comes from being the one who worries so somebody else doesn't have to. Walt went straight to the bed and took Josie's good hand and didn't let go for a long time. And when he finally looked up and found me standing by the window, he didn't ask who I was. Thank you for staying with her, son. His voice cracked in the middle, and he shook my hand like I'd done something, instead of just failed to correct a mistake fast enough. Wren wasn't as easy to get past. She looked at me, then at Josie, then back at me. Since when do you have a fiancé? You didn't say one word about anybody 2 Sundays ago at dinner. The room went very still. Josie, still thick with pain medication, managed "it's new, Wren," which was, at least technically true. New, Wren repeated, in a tone that meant she was filing the whole thing away to bring up later. And I understood right then that whatever this was going to cost me, it was going to cost me a real conversation with Wren Calder eventually. I was right about that more than almost anything else that summer. Walt asked, once the room had settled, how the two of us met, and I felt Josie's hand tighten slightly on the blanket, both of us realizing at the same moment that we didn't have a story yet, not one word of it. At the fairgrounds, true enough to hold. He nodded like that explained everything, because to a rancher, meeting at the fairgrounds explains most things worth explaining. Josie went home to the ranch 2 days later, with her wrist in a cast, and strict instructions not to lift anything heavier than a coffee mug, which she followed for approximately 1 afternoon before I found her in the barn trying to fill a water trough one-handed. The gelding, Domino, it turned out his name was, had come through the fall with a strained tendon in his near foreleg and needed cold water therapy twice a day for 2 weeks. And somehow, and I'd be lying if I called it an accident, I ended up driving out to the Calder place most evenings after clinic hours to help with both of them. Hollis Tate showed up the third evening, an old rancher who'd worked alongside my father for 30 years before he retired to a smaller spread 2 miles down the road, and who apparently still considered the Calder property close enough to keep an eye on. He watched me wrap Domino's leg with the kind of attention that meant he was really watching something else, and when I straightened up, he was still looking at the horse. "Your daddy would have liked her. She's not," I started. "I know what she's not," Hollis said, not unkindly. "I'm just telling you what I see." What I saw, over those next several evenings, was a woman who hated being handled almost as much as her horse did, who read 3 chapters of a paperback out loud to Domino every night because she said it settled him, who could talk for 20 straight minutes about hoof angles and drainage, and then go completely silent the second I asked what she planned to do about her own life once the cast came off. I learned the Calder Ranch ran thinner than it looked from the road. Barrel racing prize money wasn't a hobby for Josie so much as a second income the place actually needed, and that was most of what had scared her in the dirt that afternoon. Not just the fall, what a broken wrist and a lost season might mean for a family that couldn't easily absorb either one. One evening, Walt made supper for the 3 of us, and afterward, on the porch, while Josie was inside icing her wrist, he told me about the stent, about how close it had been, about how a man starts counting differently once a doctor's told him his own heart nearly quit on him in a grocery store parking lot. "I understand debt," I told him, without meaning to say as much as I did, and he looked at me like he'd already guessed that about me before I said it, and didn't push for more. Wren caught me alone by the truck one of those evenings, arms crossed, porch light behind her, and she didn't waste time getting to it. "You've known my sister less than 2 weeks. I don't like that hospital nurses know something about her life I don't." I told her the truth was smaller and stranger than she probably imagined, and that I'd tell her every bit of it the second Josie said I could. "Not good enough." "Maybe not," I admitted, "but it's what I've got right now, and I'm not going to lie to you on top of everything else." She studied me the same way Hollis had studied Domino's leg, checking for something specific. "Fine. But if you hurt her worse than that horse did, you'll answer to me before you answer to anybody else in this county." Fair enough. It was the first conversation we had that felt like the start of something instead of a test, though it wouldn't be the last time that summer Wren Calder turned out tougher to win over than either of her parents, and worth winning. It was Hollis, actually, who first brought up the footing. We were leaning on the arena fence a few days later, waiting on Josie to finish a physical therapy exercise the doctor had given her for the wrist, and he nodded toward the 3rd barrel marker. "Ground gave out right about there, didn't it?" It had. I hadn't thought hard about why until he said it out loud, and then I remembered, with the particular sick feeling of a thing arriving late, the memo I'd sent the fair board back in June, after walking the arena during setup week, flagging soft spots near the east rail where drainage work had been left unfinished the year before to save money. The reply had come back 2 days later under Derek's name, since grounds and facilities ran through him that season. Noted, budgeted, would be resurfaced before opening. I'd taken him at his word and gone back to the 60 other things that needed doing before Fair Week. I went home that night and dug both emails out of my folders, one flagging a hazard and one promising it handled, and sat there a long while with the laptop open, understanding for the first time that whatever happened to Josie in that arena hadn't been bad luck at all. It had been a promise somebody made and then broken. I already had a good guess whose. That guess had a name that Sunday, when a truck I didn't recognize pulled into the Calder driveway, and a man in a shirt too clean for a ranch visit got out and walked toward the porch like he still had a key to the place. Josie went stiff beside me before he'd said a word. "Derek." Derek Voss looked at her cast, then at me, then back at her, with the particular smile of a man deciding how to play a hand he doesn't like. "Heard about your fall. Came to see if you were all right. I'm fine, Josie told him, in a voice that meant the opposite. He didn't leave right away. He mentioned, almost carelessly, that he'd been on the fair board a year now, and that the contract vote was coming up that Friday, and that he'd always thought the fair could use fresher blood on the veterinary side. Somebody with real backing behind him, instead of a one-man operation running off a dead man's client list. He looked at me the whole time he said it. Then he turned back to Josie and asked, almost as an afterthought, how long she and her fiancé had been together, like the word tasted bad going out. It's not your business. He left eventually, but not before I understood two things clearly. The board vote was 5 days away, and whatever this man had lost when Josie left him, he hadn't finished being angry about it. Once his truck was off the property, she sat down hard on the porch step and told me in pieces what I hadn't known. They'd once been engaged. She'd ended it the same spring she found out his family's company had been quietly trying to buy the strip of Calder land that bordered the fairgrounds, using Derek as the friendly face on the offer. He proposed the same month he was drawing up paperwork to take part of my family's ranch. I still don't know which part of him was the lie, and which part he actually meant. I sat with that a minute, and then I told her about the memo, about the drainage, about the fact that the ground that broke under her horse had been flagged as unsafe 2 months before she ever rode into that arena, by me, and ignored by a board that included the man who'd just left her porch. 5 days, I understood she was doing the same math I was. 2 days later, Larkspur being Larkspur, a version of the story had gone around town that kept all of the ugly parts and none of the true ones. I heard it secondhand from a client at the clinic, a woman who meant well and told me anyway that I'd conveniently found myself engaged to a Calder right as my fair contract came up for renewal. And wasn't that a stroke of luck for a vet who owed the bank money? I don't know if Derek started it. I know he didn't stop it, and I know it moved faster than any truth ever does in a town that size. I heard the sharpest version of it myself 3 days before the hearing, sitting in a booth at the Ridgeline Diner with a plate of eggs going cold in front of me, when 2 women in the booth behind me didn't bother lowering their voices. Convenient, one of them said. Vet's about to lose his fair contract, and suddenly he's engaged to a Calder. Funny how that works out. I didn't turn around. I paid for eggs I hadn't touched and left. It was the first time all summer I'd sat still long enough to actually hear what people were saying about us instead of just feeling the shape of it secondhand. The Bridger Peak rep found me at the clinic that same week, a young man in a polo shirt with the company's mountain range logo stitched over the pocket, smiling like he already owned the place. 3rd offer. Better terms this time. Cash close. 30 days. And I could even keep working there as an employee if I wanted. Benefits and a real paycheck instead of a bank account with my name on all the debt. I told him I'd think about it, which was a lie, because I already knew what thinking about it out loud would cost me if word got around that I was considering it 3 days before a board vote that depended on people believing I meant to stay. He left the folder anyway. It sat on my desk until I used the back of it for grocery lists, which felt like the closest thing to an answer I had time to give him. Josie heard her own version at the feed store, from a woman who didn't know she was standing 3 feet away, and by the time I got out to the ranch that evening she was sitting on the porch with her good arm crossed over the cast, waiting for me with a look I hadn't seen on her before. Tell me something true. Was any of this ever about me? Or did you just need somebody sitting in that hearing on Friday, and I was convenient? I didn't have a clever answer. I told her the truth instead, that it started as a mistake I was too much of a coward to correct in the dirt of that arena, that I'd had every chance to fix it in the ambulance and at the hospital, and hadn't taken a single one of them, not because of any contract, but because some part of me had already decided I didn't want to be the man standing outside the family-only doors. I told her I couldn't prove any of that with words, not with half the county already deciding for themselves what my motives were. She didn't answer right away. I need to think. She went inside, and I drove home in the dark with nothing settled and 3 days left before the vote. The storm rolled in 2 nights later, the fast, mean kind that comes down off the mountains without much warning, and I was still awake when Wren called my cell a little after 11, her voice thin with panic, saying Domino had spooked at the thunder in his recovery paddock and gotten a leg tangled in a loose section of fence, and Josie, one arm still in a cast, had gone out into the lightning after him before anybody could stop her. I broke every reasonable speed limit on the county road getting there. I found Josie beside the recovery paddock behind the barn, soaked to the skin, trying one-handed to hold a lead rope on a horse in a full panic. And I didn't think. I just got between them the way I'd gotten over that arena rail weeks before, talking low and steady until Domino's ears came forward instead of pinned back, until his breathing slowed enough to walk him toward the barn instead of through the fence. The barn smelled like wet hay and horse sweat, and the sharp ozone bite that comes right after lightning too close for comfort. And the tin roof overhead kept up a sound like gravel poured out of a bucket, over and over, with no sign of slowing. We got him settled into a stall, and Josie sat down hard in the straw with her good hand pressed over her face, and I sat down next to her because I didn't know what else to do with my own hands. You can leave me out of it tomorrow. Derek. The hearing. You don't have to defend me. I'm not defending you. I'm defending the truth, which happens to have you standing in the middle of it. She looked up. Her hair had come completely loose from its braid, straw stuck to her sleeve, and she looked nothing like anybody's idea of a bride, and I thought she was the best thing I'd ever seen inside a barn in my life. I've spent all week trying to decide if I'm angry that you never corrected that medic, or if I'm angry that some part of me didn't want you to. I told her I wasn't sorry anymore. I'd been sorry in the ambulance, sorry for signing that form, sorry every day I let the lie keep living. But somewhere in the weeks since, sorry had turned into something with a different shape, and I didn't have a clean name for it except that I no longer wanted to go back to being a stranger she'd met once and forgotten by supper. She didn't answer with words. She kissed me instead, there in the straw, the storm still going outside, and a half-panicked horse breathing steady again in the stall beside us. And it wasn't careful or polite. It was 2 people finished pretending, and when we finally broke apart, she pressed her forehead against mine. Friday. You're going to need somebody in that room who isn't lying about anything. That's still me. That part was never pretend. Friday came to the Grange Hall the way Friday comes to everything in a town that size, which is to say the whole county found a reason to be there. I sat at a folding table with my old memo printed out in front of me. Josie sat beside me in a clean cast, and a look daring anyone in that room to say a word about either of us. Walt sat in the front row with Wren beside him, arms crossed, watching Derek the way you watch weather you don't trust. Derek sat with the rest of the board, 3 seats down from the chairman, and didn't look at either of us until the veterinary contract came up on the agenda. He spoke first, smooth as always, about fresh options and corporate backing and modernizing the fair's operations. I let him finish before I stood up and read the board my June memo out loud, date-stamped, describing the exact section of arena footing that gave way under Josie's horse 2 months later. Then I read his own reply, promising it would be resurfaced before opening, signed with his name. Then I read the line item Hollis had helped me pull from the county's public budget records that week, the $4,000 earmarked for arena drainage that spring, moved in July to cover a new hospitality tent for fair sponsors, the same sponsor tent carrying his family's company name across its banner. I asked whether anyone at that table could explain how a promise on paper had turned into a tent with somebody's name stitched over it instead. The room went quiet in the way a room goes quiet when it already suspects the answer. Derek said something about budget priorities. Hollis, sitting 2 rows back, said loud enough to carry that budget priorities hadn't stopped the board from resurfacing the parking lot that same spring, and a ripple of quiet laughter moved through the crowd that wasn't really about the parking lot at all. Connie Buell stood up from the back row before anyone could gavel her down and said she was the one who'd pointed at me that day in the arena, and she'd give the same answer again, because whatever paperwork existed or didn't, she'd never seen two people look at each other the way Josie and I had looked at each other in the dirt. Derek, cornered, did what cornered men do. He turned it personal. Before this board gives Mr. Marsh anything, the middle of it, somebody should ask whether he's really her fiancé or whether that's one more story this county's been asked to take on his word. Every face in that hall turned toward me. I felt Josie go still beside me. I could have hedged. I had a careful sentence ready with enough room in it to slide out the back of. Instead, I told them exactly what happened. The mix-up in the dirt, Gail Thorne's grip on my hand, the form with one word on it I hadn't had the nerve to argue with that day. I told them I'd had 100 chances to correct it and hadn't taken a single one, and that the reason wasn't the contract sitting on that night's agenda, because I hadn't thought about the contract once in that arena. The only thing I'd thought about was not letting go of her hand. So no, I wasn't her fiancé that day, and there was no legal document making us anything to each other. Everything I'm telling you about that form is true, but nothing that's happened since is a mistake anymore. That part I'd sign again in front of every person in this hall, right now, if she'd let me. Josie stood up next to me before I'd finished the sentence, took my hand in front of the whole room the same way she had in the dirt of that arena, and told them she didn't need a piece of paper to know what was true, and that she'd trust the man who admitted a mistake over the one who'd spent 2 months burying a safety warning to fund his family's sponsor tent. Wren stood up next, unfolding her arms, and said she'd like the record to show that whatever her sister's fiancé had lied about, it wasn't the part that mattered. And that was the moment I understood I'd finally passed whatever test Wren Calder had been running on me since the hospital. Walt didn't say anything. He just stood there beside his daughters, which turned out to be enough. The chairman called the vote 20 minutes later. Derek abstained. Every other vote on that board went to renew my contract, with new funding attached for the arena repairs. Derek resigned from the board before the meeting even adjourned, and I heard later that his family's offer on the strip of land bordering the fairgrounds quietly fell apart within the month, once nobody with any real influence was left pushing it. The renewed contract gave the bank enough security to refinance the balloon payment instead of calling it due, and by the end of September the bank had stopped calling. The clinic waiting room had more new faces in it than I'd seen in 2 years, half the county having apparently decided that a man who'd stand up in a packed Grange hall and admit his own mistake was a man worth trusting with a sick animal. Bridger Peak's 4th offer arrived by certified mail that October. I never opened it. Domino spent 6 careful weeks on a rehab schedule I wrote out myself, hand walking first, then light lunging, then finally cleared by ultrasound to go back out with the rest of the herd, favoring that near leg a little on cold mornings even so, same as I favor an old shoulder injury on mine. Josie's cast came off the 2nd week of October, and the first thing she did with 2 working hands was fix the exact stretch of fence Domino had gotten tangled in during the storm, because she said she wasn't going to spend one more night trusting somebody else's repair. I stood there and watched her do it and didn't offer to help, because by then I understood some things she needed to fix herself, and some things she only needed me standing close enough to hand her a tool. Wren still shows up for Sunday dinner every week, and these days she's the one arguing with me about vaccination schedules for the ranch dogs, which I've decided is her way of admitting I passed whatever test she'd been running. Hollis comes by the clinic most Friday mornings for coffee he insists is better than his own, though I suspect he mostly comes to needle me about how long it took me to notice what he'd already seen that first week. Domino gets ridden most mornings now, cleared fair and square, usually by Josie, occasionally badly by me, and neither of us minds when he decides to remind us both who's really in charge. I asked her for real on a Tuesday in November. No crowd, no lightning, just the two of us in the clinic waiting room after hours, sorting through paperwork for a low-cost spay and neuter drive she'd talked half the county into funding. I'd carried the ring in my coat pocket for 11 days by then, waiting for a moment that felt like it belonged to the two of us instead of to an accident, or a hearing, or anybody else's version of the story. A man doesn't get many chances to make a mistake come true on purpose. I got one, and I took it. She looked at the ring, then at me, and laughed the same way she'd laughed at Domino for being dramatic that first morning in the straw. Guess we'll have to tell the whole town this time it's official. I signed a form once that called me your fiancé before I knew anything about you beyond your name, I told her. I think I can manage explaining the real version. She held out her hand. Not the one that used to wear the cast, the other one. Say it then. So it's official. Fiancé, I said. Again. Fiancé, I said. And this time nobody had to hand me a clipboard to make it true.